Last year, I created a fact hunt episode about double ports. The same, yet completely different coded game released on the same system twice, and more so, the bizarre reasons as to why. But as good as just 5 examples are, you know how it is. As soon as you discover one, the floodgates open and a tsunami of suggestions appear, kicking yourself that you didn't include it the first time. So this episode, we return to these twofold titles, these voluminous vidges, and these polymorphic programs, as we go back and retcon these glaring omissions from last time. Something a certain other individual wishes they could do with their career. But, hello you, I'm Guru Larry, and I welcome you to Fact Hunt. 5 insane reasons games were ported to the same system twice. 2. Yeah, I know it still sounds messed up grammatically, but it now fits even worse on the video title bar.
Something's coming up the plumbing for Luigi's in a bind. Giant turtles out to get him, creepy crabs are right behind. Fighter flies, cheaper shites, they're all coming out the pipes. Mario, where are you?
Let's start off with a real doozy. A game from a franchise that will be more than familiar to anyone with a passing interest in video games. Mario Brothers was the very first solo game for the rotund Italian plumber, which also introduced us to his brother for the first time. The one and only, I'm not just a lazy palette swap, Luigi. Coming 2 years before the Super games were first introduced, this single-screen platformer was first released in arcades in 1983 and would set the basis for all future Mario games to come. Mario Brothers is a fun and enjoyable little romp where the idea was to knock turtles, crabs and flies on their backs and collect all the coins. The home rights for the game were picked up by Atari, who promptly released a more than competent port for their best-selling Atari 2600 console, followed by a more advanced iteration for their new 5200 Super System console. Now, this is where it all gets a bit messy. Because, as many of you will know, the 5200 hardware was identical to that of Atari's existing 8-bit computer range. So it will come as no surprise to learn that Atari also advertised a cartridge for their home micros too. But despite appearing in numerous catalogues and advertisements, the Atari 8-bit computer version of Mario Brothers was never officially released. Now, there are actually 2 reasons for this. The first is that Atari's flagship 5200 was failing to catch on with consumers in the wake of the great North American video games crash. With the system stumbling, Atari chose to hold back the Atari 8-bit ports of several big arcade games, hoping that this would boost sales of the 5200. Of course, this didn't work. And before long, Atari's parent company Warner Brothers were offloading the consumer division to former Commodore boss Jack Tramiel. Fast forward a few years to 1987, and Atari had a new console on the market, the Atari XE game system. Like the 5200 before it, this was another attempt to repackage Atari's aging 8-bit computer line into a simple cost-saving console. Although, unlike the Super System, this new console would only use all existing Atari 8-bit cartridges, but could also be upgraded to a fully fledged computer with the addition of a few add-ons. In fact, many describes the XEGS as the 5200 done right. Using existing hardware gave Atari access to an almost instant software library, repackaging many existing games in swanky new blue boxes. In America, the XE game system's biggest rival was the NES, and Atari even set about creating a series of adverts mocking Nintendo's console, calling it nothing more than a toy compared to the might of their own upgradable system.
Nintendo has a toy robot, but only Atari gives you a keyboard for playing advanced computer games. It even comes with the amazing Flight Simulator 2 cartridge. The new Atari XE video game system. Unbeatable.
But, wanting to piss off Nintendo even further, they promptly released XE versions of 3 of Nintendo's biggest hits, Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr. and Mario Brothers. which they still had the license to publish from their Warner years. Only thing was, they had one big problem. Nobody could find the source code to the original Atari 8-bit version of Mario Brothers. So they had to completely remake the game from scratch for the sole reason of annoying Nintendo. And in case you are wondering, Sculptured Software's later XE port is the much better one of the two in pretty much every single way. In fact, it rivals Nintendo's own NES port in many ways, much to their chagrin. While many of us associate the Commodore 64 with the British home computer boom and its playground battles of the ZX Spectrum, it was also extremely popular across the pond too. So while US Gold were feverishly snapping up all the best American-made games for the British market, several other publishers in the US were doing the complete opposite. One such company was California-based International Development Group, or IDG for short. Keen to exploit the world of arcade licenses, IDG struck an exclusive with Sega to release Commodore 64 versions of all their most popular games in North America. They also saw smart money in this, as in many cases they would simply sub-license the European developed versions of said games and just convert them to NTSC for their own market. Luckily for our friends in the land of the rising apple pie though, IDG, unlike many of our own software houses, actually had a degree of quality control and weren't just happy to release any old bollocks hoping it would sell on the name alone. One such game that failed the inspection process was Activision on Software Studios' abysmal port of Afterburner. Okay, the Commodore 64 was hardly designed to play arcade-perfect conversions of advanced coin-ops like Afterburner, but this really was a steaming pile of poo. So IGD contracted the amusingly named Weeby Games to come up with a new version, which thankfully turned out to be 1,000,000 times better. So those of you out there who do own the original Activision port, I highly recommend you hunt down IDG's US version for a much more authentic Afterburner experience on your Commodore 64. That or just emulate the arcade version, you know, this is the 21st century after all. There. Now this one is a little different to all the others on the list because it actually involves using different configurations of the same hardware. So yeah, just hear me out on this one. In 1982, a US company, StarPath, released an incredibly new peripheral for the then market-leading Atari 2600. This device would plug into the cartridge slot of your console and allow you to play games from tape by hooking it up to a regular cassette player. In addition, this unit also added an extra 6K of RAM to the 2600's almost non-existent 128 bytes, giving these new games much more memory to play with. Only 10 official games were ever released for the supercharger, due to a number of different factors, including the high price of buying the unit and the impending North American video game crash. Hello again. Of these, StarPath's premier title was a conversion of the hugely popular Konami-developed Sega coin-op, Frogger. Now, I know what you're thinking. Hadn't Parker Brothers already released a perfectly decent port of Frogger for the 2600? Well, yes they had. But because Parker had only licensed the rights to release the game on cartridge, this left StarPath able to snap up magnetic media rights. The extra memory and storage capacity meant that StarPath's version of Frogger was far superior to Parker's and was even lauded by many as being arcade perfect. It's also interesting to note that this same loophole also saw Sierra Online release tape-based versions for the Atari 8-bit, Commodore 64 and TI-99 computers too. Although these ports did remain quite similar to Parker Brothers' cart versions, however. The name Dandy may not be instantly familiar to many of you, and no, I'm not talking about the comic here, but the game became the inspiration for one of Atari's greatest arcade hits in Gauntlet, and set the template for the genre we now know as a dungeon crawler. Released in 1983 for the Atari 8-bit computers via the Atari Program Exchange, or APX as it was better known as, John Pavlovich's Dandy became an almost instant hit. Famed for being one of the very first games to offer simultaneous 4-player gameplay, as well as a unique level designer, it was later licensed by Activision's spin-off label Electric Dreams in the UK and ported to other 8-bit micros, albeit in a heavily adapted form. In 1985, arcade company Atari Games, which had split from the consumer division of Atari a year before, released a seminal Gauntlet. Created by the genius behind games such as Centipede, Asteroids and Super Breakout, Ed Logg, Gauntlet set arcades on fire with its huge 4-player cabinets, booming stereo speakers and coin-hungry dungeon crawling gameplay. It still remains one of Atari's greatest success stories, and was followed by numerous sequels, as well as a more recent modern remake. Over on the flip side of Atari, Jack Tramiel's consumer division was finding it tough to get new games onto their consoles in the wake of Nintendo's draconian third-party licensing agreements, which meant that anyone who signed up could only release games for their best-selling NES console. Not put off by this, Atari got creative. Looking to the home computer market rather than the arcades for inspiration, it wasn't long before their eyes were drawn to Dandy, a game they had previously published on disc for their own home computers. This game was remarkably similar to Gauntlet, and in fact, Ed Logg himself had stated in interviews that he wrote Gauntlet as a follow-up to Dandy. What was better was that they already owned the rights to it, so tight-fisted Jack didn't even have to open his wallet. Atari turned to prolific US coding shop Sculptured Software to produce new versions of the game for the Atari XE game system, as well as the Atari 2600 and 7800 consoles. Not only was the game adapted slightly to look and play much more like Gauntlet, the name was also changed to the far more foreboding Dark Chambers, but John Pavlovich's name still appeared on the title screen. And being the cheeky scamps that they are, Atari even went as far as promoting the game to the press as the prequel to arcade hit Gauntlet. As an interesting aside, that confuses matters even further. Atari Games ended up suing Electric Dreams for their versions of Dandy because they did precisely what their neighbours at Atari Corp did, make changes to the source material to closer ape Gauntlet. So in other words, they made the original and they got sued for ripping off the rip-off. Okay? Okay. It's always good to save the best until last. And names definitely don't get any bigger than Star Wars. Of course, there have been squillions of Star Wars games over the intervening decades, so I probably should specify which one I'm whittering on about. The title in question is a conversion of Atari's groundbreaking 1983 vector-based arcade game, regarded by many as a definitive video game adaptation of the George Lucas vehicle. The versions of Atari Star Wars that most people are familiar with are Domark's numerous 1987 home computer adaptations that appeared on almost every home micro out there, from the Acorn Electron BBC Micro to the Atari ST. But what many people don't know is they were far from the first company to port this game, and in fact they released ports for many systems that already had one. Once again, we turn to our old friends at Parker Brothers.
It's the bloody Parker Brothers!
Who were in fact the first ever company to pick up the video game rights to the Star Wars universe. Originally releasing titles such as The Empire Strikes Back, Jedi Arena and Death Star Battle for the Atari 2600, they also grabbed the rights to produce home versions of the Atari Coin-Op too. But, once again, the almost complete destruction of the North American games market caused by the consumer crash of 1983 meant that many people never even saw these versions, or even knew they existed. Versions for the Atari 2600, ColecoVision, Atari 5200, Atari 8-bit and Commodore 64 did make it to market, but a ZX Spectrum version, intended to be released as an Interface 2 ROM cartridge, fell by the wayside. All of the Parker Brothers conversions were targeted at cartridges, and, while perfectly playable, made many sacrifices when compared to the arcade original. This meant that Domark's later tape and disc versions were much more impressive and retained far more of the elements that made the original coin-up an all-time classic. So, thanks Dom and Mark. The Force was definitely with you.